is going. No fiddle. There we go.
What's up, Joe?
Hello, Isaac.
How's Lawrence?
How are you, man?
Doing all right.
Doing all right?
Yep.
Good.
Hey, Chuck. Good to see you, man. Doing well.
Good. Lawrence? Huh? Have a good time? Do it again next week. No, we're going to Branson, our children have demanded we have a family reunion at Branson. Or we're going to be at ours. Anyway.
All of you well now?
Am I well now?
All of you well now? All of them?
Yeah, until I start taking medicine probably tomorrow.
You good?
Yeah. I got nodules in my pelvic cancer.
When did you find that?
Well, I've known it for a while.
Well, my word.
I just now went to an oncologist, and they gave me, they're giving me some pills that they're hoping will control the nodules.
We won't grow nothing, run in like cysts or something.
It's
When they moved it?
from prostate surgery that I had in '95.
And if you don't want to.
I think that's the guy who told me that we'll get.
Oh, they hit me. Yes, he probably wants a jelly ham, but I said, you don't wait, you don't want that.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you don't use jelly jars that much, but that's okay.
Well, that's what he said. He said, nah, I said, well, so now people go, hey, it's just horse meat. Hello. Have you been scheduled for your booster?
No, I got a point scheduled though.
Because I
I
want
had
to
the Moderna shot, so I can't get it until they approve Moderna.
You know, that's why I was wondering at Church of Christ when my sister go to Northeast, come see video and Saturday 8 to 12. They said all of them, but I figured, I didn't think Moderna.
Right, time on
I said, so once I get a booster.
Yeah.
it.
Hello, Chuck. Glad you made it back.
Yeah, do it again next week.
Where are you going next week?
Up to Branson, Hollister.
Why?
My
'Cause you
kids-
want to?
My kids decided we we're gonna have a family reunion this year.
Oh, well, that changes everything. Well, you better be here on the 17th of October.
For our meeting.
Well, no, our meeting is the week after that.
What's the one 17th?
Well, Arthel's gonna preach Sunday night, I'm gonna preach Sunday morning, and I'm gonna preach on,
I'm not coming Sunday morning.
There's no suicide.
you shouldn't, because I'm gonna preach on spiritual suicide.
Oh, that's right, spiritual suicide.
Yeah,
We won't, not let's do that.
but we do have members that do it.
Yeah, I'll be back 15th.
You better be.
I was watching the movie.
You know, how can I teach a class if you're gonna keep running off?
I'm good.
Oh,
Dad,
what?
I just watched the movie, man, shot the God, shot himself, that's spiritual suicide.
Well, yeah. That's physical suicide.
It's spiritual.
You know, First and Second Samuel list 5 or 4 people that committed suicide. Yeah. Judges list 1 person that committed suicide, and Matthew and Acts list 1 person that committed suicide. And theirs were all physical suicides. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell a parable which deals with spiritual suicide. And that's all I'm going to say about that. That's right. No. In fact, I'm still working on it. I'm trying to find a suitable PowerPoint template that I can use for it. And as I was working on it with all the scriptures and everything, I only had 8 pages. So I'm having to reduce it. I'm down to 6 pages now.
So you can always make it a 2-part lesson.
Well, I could, but I'm going to get it in 1 part.
The preacher went down to read, and the whole church hanging out over his bell. Not my one, no, it's over by, what's the name of that festival over the Winter Spring? It's the one song lays out. Well, they agree on that road. Beautiful.
Well, the clock on the wall says it's time to begin. So the only people we don't have here right now is John and Pat. And they may come wandering in shortly. I did send an email message out if you didn't get it on Daryl Sharber. Daryl now has 80/20 vision. Yeah. But it was a significant surgery. He still has to stay on his left side for a month. So they have to watch him pretty close. And but other than that, it's healing well. His ribs are still sore from them being hairline fractured. And if you didn't hear the news, James Hutchison is only going to have stents put in his arteries. He's not going to have open heart surgery or anything. There's Pat. Hello, Pat. In your handout is pages 3 and 4. I think we'll probably get to some of the questions tonight on chapter 1. We're at verses 29 through 33 of chapter 1 right now. And so, Chuck, since you were gone and everything, we'll have a little remedial training.
Beloved Father, we thank you for the day that we've had and for the many blessings that you have bestowed upon us. And we're thankful tonight, Father, for the time that we can come together as thy people and study those things that will help us to further understand and to abide by from thy word. We ask you to be with Dale as he directs the lesson, be with us as we pay attention, and may we apply those things, Father, in our lives that need be. We ask you, Father, to be with those that cannot be here tonight, especially Brother Darrell. We pray that you be with him and may he recover to a good portion of his health. We ask you, Father, to forgive us of the things that we have done against thee, and may we walk with thee day by day until that time comes that we leave this earth. It's in the name of your Son that we pray. Amen.
Amen. But Chuck, I appreciate you leading us in prayer, but that wasn't the remedial training I was talking about.
You want me to do that?
Well, I appreciate it, and I'm glad you did. All right, let's go to Deuteronomy, the first chapter, and let's look at verses 29 through 33. Now, when we read this, the first thing I'll say to you is if you went back to Numbers, the 14th chapter, verses 6 through 10, that records only Joshua and Caleb pleading for the people's faithful obedience, okay? Here, though, we're finding that Moses tells the people not to fear and tells the people that God will fight for them. So that's what we're going to see in these verses. Let's begin at 29 through 33. Donna, let's begin with you.
Then I said to you, do not be shocked, nor fear them. The Lord your God who goes before you will himself fight on your behalf, just as he did for you in Egypt before your eyes. In the wilderness where you saw how the Lord your God carried you, just as a man carried his son in all the ways that you have walked until you came to this place. But for all of this you do not trust the Lord your God, who goes before you on your way to seek out a place for you to encamp, and fire by night, and cloud by day, to show you the way in which you should go.
Now, some of this over the 38, hello, John. Some of this over the 38-year period of time, these people obviously had experienced it. But then some of it, keep in mind that the Israelites were told to, on a daily basis, to teach their young people the things that had happened and the things that God expected. And so they knew all about this. And so all they had to do is believe based on what they had experienced and what they had heard on a regular basis. Secondly, they were to believe based upon God. If you go back to, and I'll not ask you to turn there, and I'm not sure if I did put it up there. Exodus, the 19th chapter, verse 4, here tells us, bearing thee in the wilderness as a man doth bear his son. And so that's the idea here. They were to believe based upon God, bearing thee in the wilderness as a man doth bear his son. Thirdly, they were to remember God and God's guidance by fire in the night and the cloud in the day. Moses admonishes Israel to think back on these things and to believe on these things. Sadly, though, Moses records, "Yet in this thing ye did not believe Jehovah your God." So Israel is to base their faith in God's participation in the battle. While the events of Egypt and Sinai and the wilderness provisions were fresh on their minds, they have a faith failure and it claims that God hates us. Now look at verses 34 through 39. Karen, you want to read that?
Let me find it. And the Lord heard the sound of your words, and was angry, and took an oath, saying, Surely not one of these men of this evil generation shall see that good land of which I swore you to your fathers, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it, and to him and his children I am giving the land on which he walked, because he wholly followed the Lord. The Lord was also angry with me for your sake, saying, Even you shall not go in there. Joshua the son of Nun, who stands before you, he shall go in there. Encourage him, for he shall cause Israel to inherit it. Moreover, your little ones and your children, who you say will be victims, who today have no knowledge of good and evil, they shall go in there. To them I will give it, and they shall possess it. But, no, that's part of it.
That's good enough. Thank you. So far, Moses tells Israel that God had given Israel 3 commandments. He told them to travel. He told them to possess Canaan. And finally, he told them not to be afraid. 3 commandments. So when Israel rejected these commands, God did not allow them to have his gift of Canaan. Faith is evidenced by one's obedience. Turn to John, the 3rd chapter, verse 36. And Jack will look at Hebrews chapter 11, but I just want to read the first 3 verses, okay? Because we know that's pretty much the faith chapter. But we get the point in the first 3 verses. So, Pat, if you'll read John 3, verse 36 for me, please.
He who believes in the Son has everlasting life, and he who does not believe in the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God abides in him.
Yeah. Now, here's the point. And I'm going to use this in the sermon I'm going to preach. But I saw this on Facebook, so I'm going to share it with you anyway. It was a kind of a cartoon, but it said to the audience, how many of you want to go to heaven? Now, obviously, everybody's going to raise their hands. Everybody wants to go to heaven. But the second question was, how many of you will obey God's commandments to get to heaven? Now, probably not 100% would raise their hands on that. Deer Creek Church of Christ is looking for a preacher right now. They interviewed an individual. My son came by and asked me what I thought the other day about this individual. I told him, I said, first off, I wouldn't hire him. And I said, here's why. I said, one of the questions I always ask somebody that's wanting to preach is, where do you stand on Matthew 19:9 on divorce and remarriage? He said, well, we asked him that question. He says, well, and he said he got very emotional. He says, I just hate to think that all of these divorces and remarriages, all the children involved and everything, I just hate to think that we would be judgmental on that. And I said, I made the comment, I said, well, here's the thing we need to be thinking about. If a person says, I think, or I feel, then that person's not qualified to be an elder or anything else. But if a person says, God says, and can turn to the scriptures, then that person's qualified. And so anyway, I don't think they're going to hire that individual, but but that's where my son goes, and so I thought I'd bring that up. The point is that not everybody today is willing to do what God said. And that's the problem with the Israelites here. They're not willing to do what God said. Look at Hebrews, the 11th chapter, and Jack, read verses 1 through 3 for me.
Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it the elders obtained a good testimony. By faith we understand that the worlds were framed by the word of God, so that the things which are seen were not made of things which are visible.
Okay. And so we know the rest of that chapter and everything because it gives specific examples of people who live by faith. Abraham and Isaac and all the others that live by faith. But the Apostle Paul had exclaimed that the Gentiles who refuse faith and obedience to God is without excuse because he had the evidences of creation to make such a determination. Look at Romans, the first chapter, Chuck, verses 18 through 23.
Verses 18
through 23, yes.
For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools, and changed the glory of the incorruptible God into an image made like corruptible man, and birds, and four-footed animals, and creeping things.
Now, Paul went on to say in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 3 of Romans that the Jews were without excuse because they were given the oracles of God. Florence, read verses 1 and 2.
What advantage then has the Jew, or was the prophet of circumcision? Much in every way, chiefly because to them were committed the oracles of God.
So Moses thereby concludes that the man who knows God and his commands and does not do them is part of an evil generation and in fact is committing spiritual suicide. Just had to throw that in. So the evil is in the form of rebellion when you get right down to it. Look at Deuteronomy, the first chapter again, and I want to read verse 26, which says, "Nevertheless, you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God." And also look at verse 43. Verse 43 says, "So I spoke to you, yet you would not listen, but rebelled against the command of the Lord, and presumptuously went up into the mountain." So to rebel then is to refuse allegiance to or to resist or defy an authority. It is to feel or express strong unwillingness, an act or show of defiance. And this is exactly what the Israelites were doing, and that's why they ended up wandering for 40 years in the wilderness. God said that the reason Israel did not believe was because they were unwilling to follow his commands. And the people, in essence, were too lazy and fearful to follow God's commandments. And if God's gifts were not handed to them on a silver platter, then they wanted no part of it. It's kind of like, you remember back there when God instructed Moses to create the brazen serpent and put it out in the middle of the camp, that if they were bitten by the fiery serpent, that they would have to look upon that brazen serpent and then they would be saved. Well, the attitude, if you've ever read the book muscle and shovel. He gives an example in that book, and basically he says, think about this. He says, the individual says, well, I believe in God, and I believe God is going to save me. And he stays there on his bed. He refuses to get up and go look out at the brazen serpent. I know the brazen serpent's there, and I believe in God, and I have faith. But the command God gave was you get up out of your bed, you walk out the entrance of your tent, and you look towards that brazen serpent, and then you will be saved. And it's the same thing with the land of Canaan here. The only way they're going to inherit this promised land is they're going to have to go in and take it. It's not going to be given to them. But they want things given to them on a silver platter. When they didn't have the things that they were used to in Egypt, they wanted to go back to Egypt. They weren't happy with the manna. They wanted meat. God gave them quail. They weren't happy with that. They weren't happy that they didn't have water. And yet, as we talked last week, we looked at Deuteronomy here, and we find that during that whole 40 years of time, they didn't have to make any clothes. They didn't have to make any shoes, because their clothes and their shoes never wore out. God constantly took care of them, but yet they didn't have the faith. And so the Word of God often refers to such a heart as a hard heart, i.e. a mind that hears God's commands, but is unwilling to do them. Look at Exodus, the 9th chapter, and Isaac, read verse 34, and then go to the 10th chapter and read verse 3 for me.
And when Pharaoh saw the rain, the hail, and the thunder, he sinned yet more, and he hardened his heart, he and his servants. 10:3. So Moses and Aaron came in to Pharaoh and said to him, Thus says the Lord God of Hebrews, how long will you refuse to humble yourself before me? Let my people go, that they may serve me.
So then the two men of the 12 spies that were unafraid, they were willing to, and unafraid of the enemy for the sake of God, they were the ones, Joshua and Caleb, they were the ones that were promised entrance into God's promised land. Any comments up through verse 39 or questions? Yes, Pat.
I was reading this, and the Bible that I was reading said something about 40 years and then 11 months. Was that, did I misunderstand that?
No, you didn't misunderstand it. They spent 1 year and 1 month at Mount Sinai. And then they moved from Mount Sinai to Kadesh Barnea. In the wilderness, they wandered basically for 38 years. So now you had 39 years and 1 month, okay? So the 11 months you were reading, that's where the 11 months comes in. They're up there ready to move into the land of Canaan right now. But Moses, in Deuteronomy, is giving 3 sermons, basically 4 sermons, to the Israelites before they enter in. And he's reminding them, because this is a new generation, he's reminding them of everything that has taken place over this 39 years and 1 month. And so at the end of the 40 years, that's when they will move into the promised land. Okay?
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? All right, let's look at verses 40 through 46. John, you want to read that for me? Chapter 1, verses 40 through 46.
Get back to it. But as for you, turn you and take your journey into the wilderness by the way of the Red Sea. And ye answered and said unto me, We have sinned against the Lord. We will go up and fight according to all that the Lord our God commanded us. And when ye have girded on every man his weapons of war, ye were ready to go up into the hill. And the Lord said unto me, say unto them, Go not up, neither fight, for I am not yet among you, lest ye be smitten before your enemies. So I spake unto you, and ye would not hear, but rebelled against the commandment of the Lord, and went presumptuous up into the hill. And the Amorites, which dwelt in the mountain, came out against you and chased you, and as bees do, and destroyed you in Seir, even unto Hormah, and ye returned and wept before the Lord, but the Lord would not hearken to your voice, nor give ear unto you. So ye abode in Kadesh many days, according unto the days that ye abode there.
Okay. Why did the Amorites defeat the Israelites? God told them not to go up, didn't he? So God wasn't with them, was he? And they went on their own, and when we go on their own, yes.
God told them to go into the land, and they said no, so he said, I'm not with you, and they decided they'd go later.
Yeah, and that's the key. If you go back to verse 40 and you look at those first few words, but as for you, in other words, the unfaithful, they were to leave and never enter Canaan. The unfaithful of all ages have no place in God's promised place of rest. Let's go and look at Hebrews, well, I don't want to read all that. That's a long reading, but let me just see what I do want to read, Donna. We'll go to you. Hebrews, the 3rd chapter. Yeah, read through verse 6, 1 through 6 for me. I'm sorry, no, I don't want to read that. Start with verse 8 and read through verse 11.
Do not harden your heart as when you provoke me, as in the days of trial in the wilderness, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my work for 40 years. Therefore I was angry at this generation, and they said they always go astray in their heart, and they do not know my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest.
Okay, and then if we go down to chapter 4 of Hebrews, and we look at verses 7, let's look at verses 6, 7, and 8. Donna?
Therefore, since it remains for some to enter it, those who formerly had good news preached to them failed to enter because of disobedience. He again fixes a certain day, today, saying, through David, after so long a time, just as has been said before, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. For if Joshua had given them rest, he would not have spoken of another day after that. Okay.
Now you can read that whole deal, which is good reading, the 8th verse of chapter 3 through the 8th verse of chapter 4. Back in Deuteronomy, though, Moses reminds Israel how they even rebelled against God's command to turn back into the wilderness. God commanded Israel not to go up against Canaan, yet they went anyway and were soundly defeated, as we read. Their calamity was a direct result of their rebellion to God. So, when Israel cried out to God in a state of rebellious disbelief, Jehovah, or God, did not hear their voice. And the rebellious can cry to God all they desire, yet God will not hear a single word. And let's look at some of those scriptures I have up there. First off, let's go to Psalm 34, verses 15 and 16, Karen.
The eyes of the Lord are on the righteous, and his ears are open to their cry. The face of the Lord is against those who do evil, to cut off the remembrance of them from the earth.
Okay, Pat, Psalm 66, verse 18.
If I regard iniquity in my heart, the Lord will not hear.
And then Psalm 109, verse 7, Jack. And Chuck, I'm going to jump over to Isaiah chapter 1 for you, verses 11 through 15.
When he is judged, let him be found guilty, and let his prayer become sin.
Okay. So Isaiah chapter 1, verses 11 through 15.
7 through 15.
11.
11 through 15.
Yes, sir.
To what purpose is the multitude of your sacrifices to me, says the Lord? I have had enough of burnt offerings of rams and the fat of red-fed cattle. I do not delight in the blood of bulls or of lambs or goats. Through what?
Through 15.
When you come to appear before me, who has required this from your hand to trample my courts? Bring no more futile sacrifices. Incense is an abomination to me. The new moons, the Sabbaths, and the calling of the assemblies, I cannot endure iniquity and the sacred meeting. Your new moons and your appointed feasts, my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you spread out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you make many prayers, I will not hear. Your hands are full of blood.
No, it was God that commanded that they observe these sacrifices and do these things. So why is Isaiah saying that he wouldn't hear all this stuff?
Your heart was not right.
Their heart was not right. They were rebellious. And the same thing with us today. We can come to worship service today, but if our heart's not right, we're in essence rebelling against God. And God's...
Why would you come to service if your heart's not right?
Well, I can give you a number. No, it's a good question. I would venture to say some people come to service out of habit. They're not really thinking about focusing on what's being said or what's being taught. Some people refuse to come to service when it's just singing because their attitude is I can't sing or I don't like to sing. Some people might come to service just because their spouse is coming. When I was preaching in Olathe, Kansas, I might have told this story before, but it's a good story to emphasize here. Jack and Linda Thomas, they had 2 daughters. Jack was raised a Catholic. And Jack told Linda, he said, if you don't take your daughters to worship service, I'm going to take them to the Catholic church. So she made sure she went to worship service all the time with her daughters. Now, I actually performed the wedding ceremony for the oldest daughter. And I think they've got 2 or 3 children. I see pictures of them on Facebook every once in a while. She's now suffering from an autoimmune disease as well. But during that time I was preaching, we would have some get-togethers at our house and other houses and everything. And I made a point, because Jack would always come, and I made a point that every time I would sit beside Jack and get to know Jack. And Jack started coming to worship service. After about 6 weeks, I thought Jack was ready, and I preached a sermon that I thought would benefit Jack. Jack didn't respond. I was a little bit discouraged, to be honest, but I went back to the back and I was greeting everybody as they were leaving the building. And Jack comes running back all of a sudden. He says, I need to be baptized right now. And I called everybody that was still there back in, and we baptized Jack that day. Jack is still very faithful to this day. He leads singing, he does a lot of the yard work, he does a lot of the building maintenance. He's very active in the church. But he rebelled for a time period and everything because he was raised a Catholic. And I think at the time, this goes a little bit along with your question, Pat. Some people go for various reasons, but it is not necessarily the right reason. So, good question.
Okay, thank you.
Let's go to John, the 16th chapter, Florence, and read verses 23 through 27. But Jack, his name really was Jack, so I wouldn't. No, I wouldn't throw that at you. 23 through 27.
And in that day you will ask me nothing. Most assuredly I say to you, whatever you ask the Father in my name, he will give you. Until now you have asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full. And these things I have spoken to you in figurative language, but the time is coming when I will no longer speak to you in figurative language, and I will tell you plainly about the Father. In that day you will ask in my name, and I do not say to you that I shall pray the Father for you.
And then finally, let's look at 1 John chapter 3, verses 21 and 22. Isaac?
Beloved, our heart does not condemn us. We have confidence towards God. And whatever we ask, we receive from him because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in his sight.
So the point of all these verses, and we could have looked at some others and everything, is that if we are faithful to God, then he hears our word. Or he hears us, and he will respond to us, and he will take care of us. But if we are rebellious, then he is not going to hear us at all, and he's not going to be with us. God cannot tolerate evil, obviously. And so if we are rebellious, if we are evil, then obviously God is not going to be with us. Any comments or questions on chapter 17, or on chapter 1? We're going to look at some lessons that we can learn from chapter 1. But anybody have anything they want to bring up or questions? All right, the first thing, remember, God gave Israel 3 commands. And that goes back to verses 19 through 21 of chapter 1, the 3 commands, where it says, "So we departed from Horeb and went through all that great and terrible wilderness which you saw on the way to the mountains of the Amorites, as the Lord our God had commanded us. Then we came to Kadesh Barnea. And I said to you, you have come to the mountain of the Amorites, which the Lord our God is giving us. Look, the Lord your God has set the land before you. Go up and possess it, as the Lord God of your fathers has spoken to you. Do not fear or be discouraged." So he told them to go, or to travel. He told them to possess the land, but they feared, and they did not do it. So Israel was commanded to journey, first off, verse 19. Verse 21, they were commanded to go and take up possession, and also in verse 21, they were commanded not to fear the Israelites. Those were the 3 commands that we learned. So Israel obeyed the Lord's first command, didn't they? They went, but they failed to take possession of Canaan due to fear and unbelief. So they did not do the second and third command. Yes, Jack?
You know, in this trek with Moses, God was giving the commands to them through Moses. They had to have a strong belief in Moses in order to believe in God, all the commands.
They did, yeah.
So if they had any inkling that Moses wasn't right, then they just kind of... And fear does step in unless they have a real strong faith, because Moses is telling them to go and fight these people and take the land. They're not hearing that directly from God. They're hearing it from Moses, even though it's true. So it does cause some to... Well,
I agree with you, but keep in mind, though, God was always there. If the cloud was there in the daytime, God was there, and they knew that. And the fire was there at night, they knew that. If the cloud moved, they knew they had to move. And so God was there, even though God was not speaking directly to them. God did speak directly to Moses. And so...
they were reminded all the time. They stay as long as the clouds there and try to move them.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the point of this Deuteronomy chapter 1 then is, keep in mind, Israel did obey the first commandment, but they did not obey the second and the third commandment. And the idea that we're being taught here in the first chapter is that partial obedience to God's laws is equated to rebellion. And and I'm going to use the idea again. It's a spiritual suicide. It's a gamble. It would be just like, you're all familiar with Russian roulette, where you take a 6-shooter, you put one bullet in there, you spin it, you put it up here and pull the trigger. You're gambling with your life.
I had an employee that did that.
You did?
Yeah.
Did he survive?
No.
Yeah. You're gambling with your life. And And I've seen movies where, you know, it's two people in a competition and they keep trading back and forth until one of them refuses to do it because they're afraid. The idea is that it's the same thing when it comes to our service to God. If we obey part of it, but we don't obey the rest of it, we're gambling with our souls. We are committing a spiritual suicide. Joshua and Caleb then were the only two, aside from Moses, who are mentioned as being commended for wholly following God's law. Look at verse 36 of chapter 1 again, where it said, "Except Caleb the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it, and to him and his children I am giving the land on which he walked, because he wholly followed the Lord." And then go back up to 26, where it says, "Nevertheless you would not go up, but rebelled against the command of the Lord your God." So all the rest of them rebelled. Look at verse 35 also. "Surely not one of these men of this evil generation shall see that good land of which I swore to give to your fathers," again, except Joshua and Caleb. Moses saw it, but he wasn't allowed to go into it. John? Oh, I thought you had it. Thought you had a couple.
In 21 it says, "Behold, the Lord thy God hath set the land before thee, go up and possess it."
Yeah.
And in 22, they're already rebelling about it. They're not wanting to go up and possess it. They're wanting to send out people to look at it first.
Right.
So they haven't even got stepped foot on it yet, and they're already rebelling.
Exactly right. And that was the third of the three commands. That was the third one that they rebelled against. So rebellion then is defined as what? It is defined as to resist or to rebel against God's word, obviously, to feel or express strong unwillingness to do a certain thing, even though God said do it. Israel was considered an evil generation, according to verse 35 of chapter 1, because they were unwilling to do what God told them to do. Sometimes we act this way as well. We set goals, yet we do not achieve them because we become disinterested. No time, task is too hard, we're too tired, or it's just too much sacrifice, or we're afraid of failure.
Yeah. And that's where you're relying on yourself more than God, because you're afraid you're going to fail. Yeah, you're depending on yourself.
Yeah.
And that's human nature.
When I was a manager for Pfizer, one of the things we always try to teach our representatives is failure is not an option. And that should be the same thing in our service to God. The failure is not an option. So, Israel made a false assumption about God then. When Israel saw that they had to go to war to take God's gift, they concluded that God must hate them. Going back to Deuteronomy, the first chapter, verse 27. When we look to the life of Joseph, and we think about Joseph, we're made to feel ashamed of ourselves because Joseph was hated by his brothers, thrown in a pit, sold into Egypt, falsely accused of sexual immorality, thrown in prison, and yet through it all, he never lost his faith in God. So a second reason for their unwillingness then to follow God's commands was their fear of man. God never gave man a spirit of fear. Go to 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 7. John, I think it's your turn. No, but we've already read that. Okay, I'll read it while you're turning to. All right. 29 says, "Then I said to you, do not be terrified or afraid of them." Now see what Timothy has to say.
God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind.
So when we are unwilling to stand for truth in all situations of life, it may be due to our fear of man. And we are unwilling to do it. The last thing we're going to learn or remember about the first chapter is Israel indeed had a lack of faith in God's promises. That's found in the 32nd verse of chapter 1. God promised land to them, and he promised to fight for them in the 20th verse and 29 and 30. They had assurance of their faith through the events that recently happened at Egypt, the pillar of fire, obviously, by night, and the cloud during the day that guided them. And God miraculously fed them with manna and also quail in the wilderness. He took care of them. So likewise, we are without excuse for a lack of faith, for we have the evidence of creation and revelation before us. Look at Romans. Now that's a long reading. We're not going to read Romans. You can read that, Romans, the first chapter, verses 16 through 32. Okay? Because I want to look at a couple of things here. I want to look at the road to success. That's in Deuteronomy chapter 2 through 4. That's what we'll look at Sunday. But let's look at the questions that I have here, starting on page 4 of your handout. How many days did a journey from Horeb to Kadesh Barnea by way of Mount Seir take? 11 days journey. That's in chapter 1 and verse 2. Second question. God spoke to the people at Horeb and instructed them to travel where? Okay, and that's verse 7. Okay. Yes. Very good. Verse 7 of chapter 1. Third question. What did Moses do when he felt he couldn't hear all the responsibility of the people on his own? Okay, that's verse 13. What did the people tell Moses because they were afraid to go into the land? And that's verse 27. Yeah. Question number 5. Why were the people discouraged and afraid to go into the land God gave them? Exactly right. Well, they had the grasshopper syndrome, we call it. We were grasshoppers in their sight. They're giants. Absolutely. All right, question number 6. What did the Lord swear an oath to the people in his anger? Okay, that's verses 35 through 38. All right, so that's going to take us to the road to success, chapters 2 through 4. Israel now takes their faithful journey to Canaan, and they were sent into the wilderness to wander for 40 years. And we already know that, verses 1 through 7. Our bell is about to ring, but let's go ahead, Donna, and read verses 1 through 7, okay? Oh, you did?
Well, it's not ready to ring.
All right. That's all right. That bell's about ready to ring anyway, so we'll start that Sunday. That way we won't forget anything. How about that? It's in your handout. It'll be page 5, I think it is. Yeah, beginning of page 5. Yeah, and then we'll look at the questions on page 6. So we'll probably look at, let's see here. We'll definitely get chapter 2. Might get chapter 3 Sunday as well. We'll get part of it anyway. Do what? Page 6 and 7 of your handout.
6 and 7.
Yes. So any... Do what?
Oh, bottom of 5. Okay, got it.
Yeah. Any comments on chapter 1 or anything you want to add? I might add this, though. Yeah, it is fixing it. One suggestion for the next material is the book of Revelation. But I'm still open for anything. If Revelation sounds good to you, it would be a challenge. There are two, I'll say this about Revelation. There are two schools of thought about Revelation. And I've seen both schools. One of them, Harkrider, and he presents some good evidence that Revelation was written before the destruction of Jerusalem. Okay, because a lot of Revelations deals with the destruction of Jerusalem. He presents some good evidence on that. But the other school of thought is that Revelation was written somewhere around 94, 95 AD. And so if we do study Revelation, I'll present both thoughts to you, because it doesn't matter to me which one you have. But it's a good thing just to look at both ways, both thoughts, if we study that. So, but if you have some other idea, I need to know in a week or two, because I've got to start working on it.
Yeah, my vote.